The biggest test for the government of national unity failed this week when Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana was unable to table his budget on Wednesday for the first time in this country's democratic history. The rumour mill was in overdrive about a 2 percentage point VAT hike on that day, and by the afternoon the nation was nowhere close to knowing the status and future of the public purse. Another story, one that's been ongoing for months now, is the political management or lack thereof when it comes to the ANC structures in KwaZulu-Natal and Gauteng. We get a sense of the so-called reconfiguration process that is now complete. And as the first G20 foreign ministers meeting kicked off on Thursday, the aggressive antagonism from the United States persisted. I'm Ziyanda Ngcobo, and you're watching This Week in Politics.
Speaker of the National Assembly.
Nobody could have imagined, as the build-up towards the budget speech gained momentum, that Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana would ultimately not be able to table his speech. The first budget under a government of national unity was always going to be a test for all 10 parties involved, especially since the DA has continuously accused the ANC of failing to consult on major issues. On Wednesday, it was clear that members of the executive could not agree on what Godongwana had prepared to share with the nation.
I have just had a consultation with all the whips of parties. In terms of Rule 48, subsection 2, we have decided to adjourn proceedings for a date to be determined by the programming committee.
One of the bones of contention was the leak in the budget, in which there was going to be a 2 percentage point hike in value-added tax as a means to plug the holes in the fiscus.
There has not been agreement in terms of parties in the executive to actually find one another in proposals of the budget. And Cabinet therefore decided not to come and do a presentation of the budget and allow themselves enough time to re-look at the budget and come back to this House in March at the time at which they will inform us.
The EFF and Umkhonto weSizwe members of Parliament did not take kindly to the postponement, describing the moment as not only unprecedented, but also a sign that the government has collapsed.
There is no government, because if you don't adopt budget, it's clear the government has collapsed. Today we have witnessed the government of national unity, a coalition, grand coalition of DA and ANC, collapsing in front of South Africa, something that we said to all of you, that it will not last. We will never agree to increase of 2% on VAT from 15% to 17%. And that's why they are scared to come here, because it will be rejected.
This day is actually quite a shocker. We are really shocked. This is in the past 30 years, to have a day like this is a serious indication of the crisis that this country is facing. This country has got no leadership. This is what we are facing.
But other parties agreed that the delay was necessary in order to allow for consensus.
It is important that the budget must be passed by the majority. And it is important in the uncharted waters that we need to listen to each other and engage. And it is quite clear that the engagement went till late among political parties. And the first budget of the GNU MTSF could not actually be passed, and it's worth it to postpone it to March to make it a point that we find each other, and that is the consequence of the GNU, and we need to accept it, and for the sake of our country and our economy, we need to listen to each other. We support the postponement with the view of resolving the issue.
What I have seen the past 2 weeks, I want to tell the people of South Africa that I have seen humbleness, humility, and people that listen to each other. I want to congratulate the Minister of Finance. You came to present a budget which the DA, the PA, and the different parties didn't fully agree with. But the ANC were humble enough and say, let us hear you. What is it you don't like here? For 2 weeks we've been busy. We are seized with the last issue. A wise man changes his mind. We are united. This is not a one-party state. We are together, united, all of us that you see here. These ones, they will not know. They are a government in waiting. We are the government. The government is taking charge.
The man of the moment, who now had the spotlight on him for other reasons, held a briefing to update the country about why he could not table his speech.
Cabinet is united in the view that the budget must strike a balance between the interests of the public, economic growth, and fiscal sustainability. Furthermore, budget is produced and presented before the National Assembly according to rules outlined in the Public Finance Management Act. Section 27 of the Public Finance Management Act requires that the annual budget be tabled prior to the start of the financial year or, in exceptional circumstances, on a date as soon as possible after the start of the financial year, as the Minister of Finance may determine. Therefore, further discussion in Cabinet will take place in preparation for a new or amended budget to be tabled on the 12th of March 2025. You can't have the 2% alone without talking about what's going to replace it, and that does not become contentious. What I'm trying to say, what we are grappling with, is not necessarily the 2% per se. What we are grappling with, given the challenges and priorities that we are facing, how do we fund them? Really, that's the debate. Do we borrow more? What are the implications of that? Do we continue cutting expenditure? What are the implications of that? Do we raise tax? What are the implications of that? There's general agreement that in the current environment, we need to find a way of funding our priorities. The debate is what is the best way of doing it.
Godongwana claims the budget speech was deliberately leaked by a cabinet minister.
For somebody saying they were not aware, it's disingenuous. It's disingenuous because that's where the leaks about the VAT came from. Because I tabled it in cabinet. What was interesting is that some of the people who leaked were cabinet colleagues. One of them who was leaking to the cabinet, to the journalists, even went to the extent of telling the journalists what kind of questions that were asked me in cabinet. So they come here and tell you in the media and say, no, the first time they hear about this. No, we presented in cabinet, but we also said this is the direction we're likely to take. And everybody was jittery, and we didn't put the amount then.
The Democratic Alliance, which is one of the larger parties in the GNU, claimed victory for thwarting what they believed was going to be an unjustified 2 percentage point increase in VAT.
BAT was, of course, one of the matters, and I think that's been played out in the media over the last few weeks, last week, and it obviously was a very key point for me, if I wear my hat as the leader of my party. A very clear position from my party that we couldn't, in good conscience, support a 2% VAT increase, given the current economic circumstances in South Africa, and that we need to look at more innovative ways that are more pro-growth to be able to get the economy moving, to create jobs, and to end the poverty. Those are the key determinants of the medium-term development plan and objectives of them.
Speaking on the sidelines of the G20 foreign ministers meeting on Thursday, President Cyril Ramaphosa moved to allay fears of instability and said there was no need for the nation to panic.
Budgets in many countries are possibly the most important event that happens. Even in your more mature democracies, they often have budget hiccups. They often have budget mini crises, which they are then compelled to sit back and resolve and find and build consensus. And that, what happened yesterday, is in many ways the maturation of our own democracy.
But the failure to pass a budget is not the only thing that sets South Africans' tongues wagging. Godongwana's hot mic moment about SARS Commissioner Edward Kisvita brought to the fore the possible tensions in the economic cluster.
I'm glad you took the question about the commissioner. You answered it well, much better than I would have been able to.
Oh no, I was a bit, I was worried I should not be angry.
No, you answered it well. No, but you did well. Yeah. No, you did well.
He's making me angry.
Yes, no.
I said, we're discussing, even here, he comes up with this rubbish. I said, how will it help me on the 19th, even now on the 12th? He did not know that we made provision for him for 3.5 in the new arrangement. But that 3.5 now is gone.
Yes, no, all right, you finally keep it. Not by
This week, after months of deliberation, the ANC's National Working Committee finally unveiled the reconfigured structures in KwaZulu-Natal and Gauteng. Some leaders of the now-dissolved provincial executive committees were retained in the new order, but former secretaries Bheki Mtolo and TK Ngciza will now become ordinary members. I suppose the main question here is, why did it take so long?
It was important for the ANC to analyze properly what went wrong. So one assumes that they've been able to do that diagnosis better. Secondly, they needed to balance to ensure that whatever decision they make is never said to be in favor of this or that factional group. But finally, also some of the veterans who would be willing to go in and do this work.
You know, this diagnosis, though, how sure are we that it's actually going to be strategic enough for the ANC to be in recovery? Because it would seem as though they still, by and large, relying on the image of national to bolster them in the provinces and, dare I say, at a local government level as we go into the local government elections next year.
I am not sure if it will bolster them or not, because, you know, I think at the same time, even as you may have, say, Mabuya Kulu or Amos Masondo, I'm not sure to what extent they are in touch with what's happening throughout the province, be it KZN or be it Johannesburg. So in that sense, I mean, it's a hit and miss. But I just hope that the structures that will have been put together to work with them includes people who have always been in the structures of the provinces and therefore will be able to help understand the challenges that they face. In each of those provinces, it's one thing to diagnose what is happening at the PEC level. You still have to say in each of the regions, what were the results, what went wrong, and how do we move forward? Did we lose because people went, say, to MKP, or because people stay away? And if they stayed away, how are you going to get them to come back in 2026? And if, for instance, you could not bring those who stayed away in 2026, in 2021, if you didn't bring them in 2024, how sure are you that you can bring them in 2026? So they'll have to hit the ground running.
When we return, we reflect on what President Cyril Ramaphosa's response to his U.S. counterpart has been and will be as that country continues with its offensive against South Africa. Plus, Ramaphosa isn't alone in this fight. Agriculture Minister John Steenhuisen held a briefing to set the record straight, and an important moment for our country's G20 presidency as it hosted its first foreign ministers meeting in Johannesburg. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back. Thanks for staying tuned to Newzroom Afrika on channel 405. Now, this week saw South Africa hosting its first G20 foreign ministers meeting. It came amid continued tensions and overt snubbing from the United States Secretary of State, Marco Rubio. And just as the gathering was set to get underway on Thursday, U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent also confirmed via social media that he wouldn't attend next week's finance ministers' meeting in Cape Town.
I think it's bad. There's no question about that. I mean, there are some suggestions here that Scott Bessent, the new Treasury Secretary, has decided to remain in the United States because he wants to attend Donald Trump's first cabinet meeting, which would be taking place at the same time as that meeting of G20 finance ministers. And one can understand why he would want to be at that first cabinet meeting. But equally, you could understand why it would be a draw to travel to South Africa, because it would be his first opportunity as Treasury Secretary to rub shoulders with many of the international finance ministers with whom he will now be dealing on a daily basis, including finance ministers from Europe, from China, from Russia, and from other G20 member states. So it is certainly raising eyebrows here that a Treasury Secretary this early in his tenure is taking the unprecedented decision to skip a meeting of G20 finance ministers designed partly to pave the way for the agenda at the full G20 Leaders Summit to be held in South Africa in Johannesburg in November. Now, Scott Bessent has not commented publicly on these reports, so there's been no statement from him or from the Treasury echoing what we heard from Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, when he announced that he was going to skip tomorrow's meeting of foreign ministers because he was embracing the falsehoods promulgated by President Donald Trump at the White House over the Expropriation Act. Donald Trump, of course, arguing that expropriation of land from white farmers is taking place in South Africa. South African authorities and others, of course, argue that it is not happening, even though it could, theoretically, under the terms of the Expropriation Act. So we don't know whether this is an ideological move that Scott Bessent is taking, or a pragmatic political move because he wants to attend Donald Trump's first cabinet meeting, or maybe it's a bit of both. You carry favour with Donald Trump by both attending the cabinet meeting and deciding that you're not going to travel to South Africa for that G20 finance ministers meeting. But certainly it raises fresh questions about whether this American government might be preparing for a full-scale boycott of the G20 summit in South Africa when world leaders are supposed to gather there at the end of the year in November.
Ultimately, it doesn't look as though there's much cooperation then in trying to find a solution to the problem. Would that be a fair assessment here? Because if you're not getting the International Relations Minister, Marco Rubio, you're not getting the Treasury Secretary as well here in Mr. Bennett, then clearly no communication at all is ultimately happening, no clearing of the air, and can't thaw any of the issues that are currently at play here.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it is pretty extraordinary to see the absence of dialogue. And as far as we can tell, there is no meaningful dialogue taking place. Remember that President Cyril Ramaphosa, and through his spokesman, announced that he was going to send a delegation to Washington, D.C. to make representations to the Trump administration and, of course, to members of Congress on Capitol Hill about the situation that is actually occurring in South Africa, as opposed to the situation that the White House and the State Department claims is occurring. Remember also that President Trump offered refugee status for Afrikaner farmers that had had their land expropriated. And of course, AfriForum turned around and said that they had noted President Trump's offer, but that Afrikaner farmers themselves, at least those allied with AfriForum, had no desire to leave South Africa and would not be taking the United States up on an offer that was made, of course, at a time when the Trump administration separately is engaging in mass deportations at a very rapid clip. no delegation has been announced by the South African government to travel here. Indeed, we were hearing earlier in the week that efforts by the South African embassy in Washington, D.C. to establish dialogue with people close to Donald Trump in the president's inner circle was going nowhere at all. And really, I think the arrival of a delegation here would have to be the starting point now of putting anything back together, especially since American cabinet ministers, plural, are now saying they're not traveling to South Africa for these routine G20 meetings.
So earlier on you spoke about this possibly being a boycott as well then of the G20. Does this ultimately mean that the US is ultimately boycotting primarily the biggest economies in the world, in essence?
I mean, it is so difficult to know what they plan to do here. They haven't said they're going to boycott the entire G20 World Leaders Summit later this year, and that obviously would be a stunning step for President Trump to take. But when you put all of this in the context of everything else that is happening today, a break between Donald Trump and the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, Donald Trump now arguing that Ukraine is to blame for the Russian war against it, describing Volodymyr Zelensky as a dictator, further enraging America's European allies who already feel as though the White House has completely shut them out of efforts to try and bring peace that President Trump is leading, at least in conversations with the Russians, even though Ukraine hasn't yet secured a seat at that particular table. Donald Trump has wondered aloud about the possibility of readmitting Russia into the G7 and turning it back into the G8. That's going to be extremely controversial with America's partners in the G7. So as President Trump stakes out this new isolationist redefinition of American foreign policy that really seems to be emphasizing that he's getting much closer to Russia than the United States has been in recent times. Who knows what the plan is for G20, which Donald Trump, of course, is supposed to be presiding over here in the United States next year, which is why, if he's not in Johannesburg in November, even the handover wouldn't be in a position to take place.
Meanwhile, President Cyril Ramaphosa, who was speaking to the media on the sidelines of the G20 foreign ministers meeting, says efforts to continuously engage the United States will continue. He poured cold water on assertions that the US snubbed our country's meetings ahead of the Leaders' Summit in November.
Well, the United States is our second largest trading partner, a very important partner in a whole number of areas in which we interface in the world, be it political, trade, diplomatic, you name it. We interface and relate to the United States in many, many ways. And because we live in an interconnected world, no country can ever say that we are not going to be doing things either together directly or indirectly. So in our case, we are committed to having a good relationship with the United States, and we do relate to them in a number of ways. And what has ensued now with the Secretary of State not attending is in the end not a train smash, because the United States is still represented here, and they are part of the G20, and the discussions that will take place here are discussions that they are going to be part and parcel of. So this is not a boycott.
I'm not sure what exactly President Cyril Ramaphosa is doing in his GNU, but he sure has managed to transform his former foes into the best of friends. I'm talking about Agriculture Minister John Steenhuisen's defense of policies one would never have thought he would uphold previously. In a briefing during the week, he made it clear that he wanted to set the record straight.
AfriForum and Solidarity are organizations in their own right, and they must account for themselves. I can only account for the Democratic Alliance. And what I can say is that my view is that some of the misinformation that's found its way to the United States, which is now clearly influencing policy there, is not based in fact or in reality of what's happening on the ground. And that is my broader concern, because the biggest people who are going to suffer as a result of this will be our commercial farmers in South Africa who are exporting through AGOA, and farm workers who will lose their jobs if we are kicked out of AGOA, or if suddenly there are tariffs on South African agricultural products.
And while the South African government is expected to send an envoy to the United States to explain the country's foreign policy, Steenhuisen says the 7th administration must build strong relations with the Trump administration.
So we need to get back onto the right page with our allies, and to make sure that we understand that we do need each other. It's in America's interest as well, I might add, to have a strong, stable constitutional democracy on the southern tip of Africa, particularly given the way some of the countries on the continent are heading away from democracy and towards authoritarianism. I don't think it's in America's interest to have a South Africa which they don't have a good relationship with as well. And I think we need to impress upon them that this is a new government. It's a democratic government. It's a result of a democratic outcome, just as theirs is, and that they need to make sure that we are able to maintain good relations from a trade perspective, but also from a geopolitical perspective as well.
That's all I have time for this week. Over the coming days, though, there will be the first G20 finance ministers meeting taking place in Cape Town. As usual, Newzroom Africa will bring you all the latest from that gathering and other big political stories. But for now, it's goodbye and thank you for watching.